Welcome to Quick Pros Quo. I'm Rin,
And I'm Zach.
and today we are talking about writing for TTRPGs. First, well, we've talked about TTRPGs on the podcast before, but if you're new, first of all, welcome. A TTRPG is a tabletop role-playing game.
We wanted to make that clarification right off the bat because there are lots of different kinds of RPGs, and the conventions are going to be different for each of them, especially when it comes to writing for like a computer game. That is a whole different ball of wax, and we are focusing on the writing that goes into preparing things for like Dungeons and Dragons or Mouse Ritter or those sorts of games.
Yeah. And we both have experience with lots of tabletop games. We when Zach and I first met in our freshman year of university, we played a Fate campaign.
Yeah,
Recently my poison of choice is Dungeons and Dragons. But I've also done Glitter Hearts and Wander Home, and I just bought the resources for Arium, which is specifically a world building game.
oh my goodness,
Um,
yes.
okay, wait, we should talk about that. We should do an episode on Arium if you know what it is, because I recently went to a writing conference and they had a major game of Arium, but I didn't go to that session. But I was emailing someone
uh
after the conference, and she was like, "This is so cool," and I just bought the source material like last night.
oh well, I was a moderator for that.
Oh, so you know everything. We should play Arium together sometime, Zach. That'd be fun.
Yeah.
Um, anyways, Zach, what other role playing games have you played? Tabletop role playing games.
Um yeah, so a lot of my I was first introduced to tabletop role-playing games through the Saga Edition Star Wars role-playing games, and then did a lot with Fantasy Flight Games Edge of the Empire system. I've also dabbled in things like D&D. I've ran Fate. I'm currently in a group that is doing a Avatar: The Last Airbender game with a system that's powered by the apocalypse, which is super fun. So I've done a couple systems.
Yeah, so we've both been around the block a little bit. So we're coming at this from not expertise, but like experience. So hopefully
Yep.
that like lends us some credibility because I know not all writers are role players, and not all writers are DMs or GMs or whatever acronym you want to use for the game master. But we do have some expertise in this, unlike writing for video games, which we know nothing about. But maybe we'll try and get a guest star on for that. I think that'd be a fun guest star episode.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so role playing games. Talk to me about role playing games and storytelling, Zach.
Yeah. So when you are writing for a role-playing game, it can be a little bit tricky because the goal is still the same, right? When you're writing a story, you're trying to entertain. You might also be trying to teach or make a statement. But you're trying to entertain, right? And when you're writing for tabletop role-playing games, you are also trying to entertain it, but the strategies that you're using for entertainment are completely different. And the reason for that is that TTRPGs are collaborative. So you're no longer the person who is, 100% control of everything that happens inside of the story. You get to share some of that with other people, and that can make it really fun and really interesting because the story goes in ways that you didn't expect. But it also presents some unique challenges in the way that you put together and um, write for the game.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I would say, oh well, I'm not going to say I'm going to agree with you, but like writing collaboratively will take writing or playing collaboratively will take your story in different directions. Um, we talked a couple episodes about The Princess Bride, and honestly, I feel like the Princess Bride movie is like a D&D campaign.
Oh yeah,
Like,
100%.
it's just a role playing game campaign. It doesn't have to be D&D. D&D is kind of a catch all phrase for me. I'm just like, Yeah, TTRPG, D&D.
Right.
Which is not true or correct at all. I recognize that. Um, but a good campaign will have options for player agency and not too much railroading, I think is a technical term. And just like give space for like ultimate possibilities, an ultimate number of possibilities. Um, yeah, those are great. Some general tips for when you're writing a campaign is first not to be too attached to an idea because you may have a super cool hook or three super cool hooks and one you really want the story to go to, but your players probably won't pick up on the same exact hook.
Yes,
Yeah.
and part of that has to do with framing, right? Because when you're writing for a role-playing game, you are trying to communicate something to the players in the same way that you will often try to communicate things, or in the same way that you will communicate things to readers as they're reading a story. But sometimes there are certain conventions that go along with role-playing games that are not the same as when you're writing. For example, descriptions, right? When you're doing a role-playing game, the length of the description is a cue for how important a particular thing is, whether it's a person or a setting or a prop within the setting. So if you spend a long time describing a suit of armor on the wall, that's going to signal to your players that there's something important about it. Um,
Yeah.
which might not be what you were going for in the first place.
Exactly. And conversely, glossing over something that seems important can also be like, oh, by the way, there's, a suit of armor on the wall. And sometimes that will get some players. Like, I think an important thing to remember with tabletop role-playing games is even the best laid plans can still be unearthed or disrupted. Because players
Yep.
are going to choose what sounds interesting, and people have different ideas about what's interesting. So, grain of salt. But if you focus on developing the setting, for example, then
Hmm.
you will be able to like create a mood for your world, I feel like I think setting is super important, set like the tone for your world. And then you
Yes.
can give, yes, go ahead. You have more to say on this than I do.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right about starting with the setting because the setting is the sandbox that everybody is going to play within, and you have a lot of control in providing the pieces for how those stories are going to go. And the next thing that you want to be thinking about is you want to be thinking about incorporating opportunities for storytelling within the setting, right? Because the story is going to happen when your players interact with the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of interacting with the world, an important part of tabletop role-playing games are the non-player characters, the NPCs. Um, these are characters that the GM plays, and if you're a really cool, good GM, you use different voices for all of them. I am not a cool GM, and I can't do voices, so none of my NPCs have different voices. If they do, they're very limited. I can do like two voices, and that's it. Um, but like if you give most, if not every NPC a hook, you allow for more variety in your story in your role playing game. And a hook, we keep using this term without really defining it. A hook is like a story waiting to be told, and they're driven by conflict.
Yeah, so for like as an example, right? If you're, if you start your campaign in a tavern, it's kind of cliche, but there's nothing wrong with that. Um, and you want to make the tavern keeper as an interesting NPC that the players are going to remember, then you're going to want to give them a hook. And the hook can be something like the, you know, the city is a dry city, so the sale of alcohol is prohibited, and so the um, barkeep is being extorted by the local sheriff in order to keep his business running. like that is a hook because it provides conflict that the characters can then act upon.
Yeah. And like that could be like a main hook. Maybe they want to be like, ooh, who's tall, dark, and handsome over in the corner? And that's always like a rogue or something who has like a bone to pick with someone out for vengeance and they need a team. So
Yeah,
see how making different NPCs with different hooks can take your story in an entirely different way. Because you
right.
don't want to just provide one hook. When I was first learning to DM D&D, I was really guilty of only doing one hook, and then my players would be like, "That's not interesting." And I had to come up with another hook on the fly, and that was really hard for me because I was so new to D&D.
Yeah, there's always the improvisation, the improvisational element. But there are things
Yeah,
that you can do with your writing to help mitigate the improvisational element, like preparing sort of a drag and drop kind of things where it's like, oh, these sorts of, whether it's this is a scene description or a setting or a character or, like a conflict, like I can just drop this into a scene and that can help with the, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do next. So that can be
yeah,
an effective way of spending your time when you're, writing for an RPG.
absolutely. And speaking of being new to TTRPGs, what happens if you have a new group, like a group that's never played TTRPG before?
Oh, this is a really great question because I have GM'd lots of groups where people are, just barely starting out. And a big part of it is trying to avoid analysis paralysis because when Rin, you mentioned this earlier, that part of the appeal of TTRPGs is that there are, infinite possibilities for what you can do and where you can go, which you just can't do inside of like a board game or a computer game. So for it's kind of that thing where we think, oh, this would be super fun to like be able to go anywhere, and then you get there and you're like, oh my goodness, I have no clue what to do next. And so for newer groups, that analysis paralysis can be a major hurdle. And so trying to like frame the choices that the characters can take can help move things along. And two ways that you can do that is by just giving them the first one or two hooks so that they have a direction to go in. So, for example, I have been kind of playing with the idea of ripping off one of my favorite computer games at the moment. It's called Against the Storm. Highly recommend it. They're just about to release a new update, and I'm very excited for it.
Ooh,
Um,
fun.
but I'm thinking about, what would an RPG look like that's based on that, and saying, oh, well, if the entire point is to like uh, craft a seal that will stop the never-ending rain, then that hook can provide a framework for the characters to work within and to tell a cohesive story because they know what the end goal is going to be.
Yeah, that's a really good point because I feel like having an overarching story in mind and like setting the big bad, especially like the first session, is really important. And that's something
Hmm.
I ran into with my first campaign, which I'm technically still in the middle of. We haven't played in a couple months at this point. But I did not set up the big bad very effectively in the first session, and I'm having the hardest time like trying to get them to like care about the big bad. And I'm like, foreshadowing is still important even in TTRPGs. I will say that.
Yep, yep, yep. And
And
sometimes the more obvious foreshadowing is better inside of a TTRPG, because in books we can afford to be clever, but sometimes you just need to be really obvious.
yeah, be blatant about it, and then you're more likely to actually have them pick up on the clues.
Hmm.
You actually, I will say you probably have one player who picks up even on the subtle cues, and that's usually the note taker of the group.
Yep.
Because there's always one note taker, and if you don't, it makes your campaign way harder. I'm a note
Yeah,
taker in the campaigns that I do not run, and my fellow players are so grateful because I just whip out my little notebook, and then I'm like, here's what the prophecy said 3 sessions ago, which is the equivalent of like 2 days in game
Yep.
and 3 months out of game.
Yep,
So
and it's
like,
very helpful to remember NPC names because I'm terrible
yeah,
with names in real life and I'm terrible with names in games too.
exactly. So pro tip, have a note taker or be a note taker. And if you're GMing, definitely be a note taker.
Yep. Rin, you said something really important about defining the big bad early on. And it's all going back to focusing on the conflict. And part of writing effectively for TTRPGs is that you want to design compelling obstacles, compelling and interesting obstacles. Note that you are not designing solutions because the characters are supposed to come up with the solutions. Um,
Hmm.
so when you're thinking about, okay, what are the obstacles? Think about, the classic example or the classic setup is you have a whole bunch of MacGuffins that need to be collected for some reason. And if you make the MacGuffins themselves interesting, then you're one step of the way. But then if you go even further and say, oh, well, I want one of them to be submerged underwater and one of them to be trapped in a mirror and another one that is going to only be visible after a forest fire. Like those obstacles create interesting stories that your players can partner with you to tell.
Yeah. And I really love that you use the term partner with because I feel like sometimes there's like, especially like perma GMs, like people who are just only ever GMing and like never players. It can be really hard to remember that the players are telling the story with you, but that's what you're doing.
Yep,
Um, like my friend Josh, bless his heart, is almost always DMing. Like he only plays in like 2 campaigns, but then he GMs like every other campaign he plays in,
yep,
which is like fine and well and good. But I know if I were in that case, I would like because I know this from running just one gym. I like to be in control, and
mm-hmm.
you have to like relinquish that power, and then you can make something greater with your players than just something you
Yeah.
can do alone. That's not all I have for this episode. Zach, do you have any closing words for us?
No, I'll just recap briefly what we talked about today in this episode. Writing for TTRPGs has the same goal as writing a story. You're just using different techniques for doing it. And the essence of those techniques is that you're focusing on the setting and you're focusing on opportunities to generate conflict. So this can take the form of character hooks. It can take the form of antagonists, MacGuffins, quests, all of that good stuff that creates conflict. And you want the obstacles to resolve the conflict to be the most interesting parts. You want to remember that you are partnering with your players in order to tell the story. And so your writing is the backdrop or a springboard against which the rest of the story unfolds. And you should remember that while you're writing. And then finally, if you are writing a TTRPG story for a new group, you're going to want to provide a bit more structure than you would if you were a doing a veteran group. And this just occurs to me during the summary, but you want to be aware of the types of stories that your character or that your players want to tell, and you want to deliver on those. So if somebody wants to play a heist, make sure that you have a heist. If somebody wants to play, Battle of Helm's Deep light, then make sure that you have a big epic battle.
That
That's
is
also
a
super
really good
important.
point. Yeah, we should have touched on the idea of a session zero, which is a
Hmm.
like pre-campaign session where you like set boundaries for the campaign and talk about what you want to get out of the campaign. That's a really helpful thing, especially in your planning.
Yep.
Cool. Well, I think that's all we have for you guys today. Thank you so much for tuning in. You should email us or comment somewhere on the social media and tell us about your favorite TTRPGs and your tips and tricks for writing for them. This has been Quid Pros Quo. Thank you so much. We will see you next week.
Quid Pros Quo is hosted by DC Winters and CK Jensen. If you like this episode, be sure to leave us a rating. And if you'd like to contact us, you can email us at quidprosquo@gmail.com. For more episodes, check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you get your podcasts.